Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing part 8 of the Summer-Ween Halloween DIY series. For this project, we're going to be making a butterfly cloche, and I'm just using a Dollar Tree cloche with an old candle holder that I already had. But before I start on the cloche, I'm actually going to be making the butterflies for this project so that I can set them aside to let them dry. I laid out a piece of plastic wrap, and then I'll be using these two napkins. One is from Dollar Tree, and the spider web one is from Joann's that I got last year. I removed the back from both of these napkins, and then for the spider web one I just cut out one of the squares, and for the one with the crows on it I cut out the wording and the spider web. I'll be making some faux rice paper with these napkins to actually cut my butterflies out with. So what I'm doing here is just using a brush and putting some Mod Podge on the plastic wrap that I laid down. Then I'm going to lay my napkin piece down on top of that Mod Podge. Then I'll carefully do another layer of Mod Podge over top of that napkin. I did the same thing with the other one and then set these aside to let them completely dry. And while those are drying, I'm going to continue working on the cloche by gluing the bottom piece of that Dollar Tree cloche to the top of my candle holder. Then I gave this entire thing one coat of some black chalk paint. To dress this cloche up a little bit, I'm going to use some of this Dollar Tree metal ribbon. But before I glue it onto the cloche, I am going to paint the backside of this metal ribbon with a coat of the black chalk paint because you will be able to kind of see the backside. Once it had dried, I glued it on to the cloche and the candle holder and gave this a coat of some black chalk paint and also did a second coat over the candle holder. By this point, my napkins were completely dry and I was able to carefully peel them off of the plastic sheet. And as you can see, these have a kind of glossy, plasticky vinyl feel and look to them, plus you can see through them. I traced out a little butterfly template that I'm going to be using, and I'm just going to place these onto the napkins where I want them, then cut out these butterflies. I'm making 2 butterflies for this cloche, but for each butterfly I am doing a larger and a smaller version of that little butterfly template. And I'll be placing the smaller butterfly on top of the larger one. I laid all of those onto a Dollar Tree cutting mat, and then I'm going to use some hot glue to make their bodies. Once the glue dried, I was able to just pop these off of that cutting mat, flip them over, and I'm going to repeat that process by adding a little more hot glue to the bottom part of their wings. Once the glue was dry, I painted both of these very carefully with a small paintbrush and some black paint. Then around the cloche on that metal ribbon, I used a little bit of Rub and Buff to bring out some of those details. For the inside of the cloche, I'm using just a little branch that I found in my yard. I cut it down and it actually fit perfectly in the small hole that's already in these cloches. So then I was able to just use a little bit of hot glue to glue my butterflies to the little twigs. And to finish it off, I'm just using a little bit of Spanish moss and a little bit of green moss, going around and just putting some of this down on the bottom and up the twig. This project's inspired by a sign that I actually saw at an antique store, just using this little wood plaque that I found at the thrift store. I'm going to be doing a faux engraved look on this sign, so I needed to make myself a little template using my letter stamps just so I'll know where everything needs to go. And this little sign is going to say, "Do not speak Latin in front of the books," and go on my bookshelf. I'm sure you have seen many of my videos already stamping clay, so that's what we're going to be doing here. It's my favorite technique to make something look engraved. I'm going to start with a large ball of clay, and I'm actually going to set this on top of that oval plaque, then roll this out over top of it so I can make sure that it goes the length and the width of this. I ended up making mine probably about 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick. Then I flipped it over onto a cutting mat and just cut around the edges, removing all the excess clay. Then I used a little bit of wood glue and went all around the edges to glue this down to the plaque. Then I laid down the little template that I made and used my alphabet stamps, just kind of lifting up the paper and placing the stamp down below. I only had to use these for each separate word, and then as the lines went down, I would put the template back down and then figure out where I needed to put my stamps. And you're just going to lightly press these stamps down into the clay. I also used some other stamps that I had just to give this a little bit of pretty detail at the top and around the sides. Once I was done stamping everything, then I took a little bit of water on my finger and just started smoothing out all those edges and any little imperfections on the top of it where my stamps had left impressions or anywhere that just needed to be smoothed out. Then I set this aside overnight to let the clay completely dry. The next day, I painted the entire thing with 2 coats of some black chalk paint. Then I used a really fluffy brush and got just a little bit of rub and buff on that brush, started going over this entire sign, and then you'll be able to see those words sticking out. Make sure you're not pressing the brush too hard because then you're going to get the rub and buff down inside the letters and not really be able to see them. I just kept going over it with very light coats until I was happy with it. For this project, I'm using a thrift store frame. This is just an oval one that I found. It didn't have a backing, so I'll have to add that. But then I'm also going to be using one of these Dollar Tree little skeleton hand tongs. These are fairly easy to cut. They are thick plastic, but if you score them, you can pretty much just snap the hand off, and that's exactly what I did. Now, like I said, this didn't have a backing, so I ended up just making one using some thick chipboard. Once I had that piece traced out and cut out, then I gave everything a couple coats of some black chalk paint, including the little skeleton hand. And I know it was already black, but it did have the shininess to it, and I really wanted it to be matte. After all my pieces were dry, then I glued in the little backing piece that I made to the frame and also used some gel super glue to attach the skeleton hand to the front of this. I wanted to add some little butterflies to this project, so I'm using this butterfly mold that I got from Amazon and some of my air dry clay, and I'm gonna just make a few of these different size butterflies, then figure out where I want to place them. I used some more gel super glue to attach all of my butterflies where I wanted them. Some of them I ended up lifting up the wings. You may have to check these as they're drying and just keep pushing up those wings. I let those clay pieces dry overnight, and then again I'm gonna go back in with some black chalk paint and paint over all those butterflies and give everything else a second coat. Once this had dried, I took it outside and sprayed it with 2 coats of my Aleene's acrylic sealer. Then I'll be using some Spanish moss and some green moss that I got from the dollar store and my hot glue, just putting this very randomly, kind of mixing the two together. Then I also have some dried florals that I'm going to put into the skeleton hand so it looks like he's holding them. And to finish it off, I'll just add a little bit more moss down in the hand to cover up the stems. For For this project, I'm using this pretty book vase that I found at the thrift store. Now, if you don't have a book vase, I actually have a video on how to make one, and I'm going to leave that link in the description box below. The first thing I'm going to do is paint this entire thing with one coat of some black chalk paint and then let that completely dry. Then I did a second coat and again just let it completely dry. For the small areas around the book pages on here, I just used a smaller paintbrush and carefully painted those. You could use painter's tape as well. While I was waiting for my book to dry, I decided to go ahead and make a little frame for the front of my book. This is an IOD silicone mold that my friend Sammy over at Unicorn Dust Design sent me. So I'm going to be using this square frame for this project and just some of my air dry clay. And once I have this finished, then I'm just going to set this frame aside and let it dry. Once the book face was dry, then I took it outside and gave it 2 coats of Aleene's acrylic sealer just to seal in that chalk paint. I went into Canva and made this little graphic with an Edvard Munch quote, and then I printed this on some rice paper. I'm gonna have this on my blog. You can download it for free and I'll have the link in the description box below. I'm gonna use my watercolor paintbrush. This is just the one from Dollar Tree and I'm just wetting this rice paper and then I'll tear around where I wet it. In the area on the book vase where I'm going to put this graphic, I'm just going to use a little bit of white chalk paint and do 2 coats just in that area. Then I'm going to add a layer of Mod Podge over top of that white area. I'm going to be doing the iron-on method for this, so I'll let this Mod Podge completely dry. When it was dry, I placed my graphic on top of there with a piece of parchment paper over it, then used my little iron to go over this entire thing for about 2 minutes. And you don't have to do it this way. I just really like doing it this way. I find it easier and also you don't have to worry about wrinkles. Now to add a little texture to this book, I'm going to be doing a raised stenciling, just using some spackling and one of my floral stencils from Amazon. Be sure your spackling is nice and creamy. If you need to, you can add a few drops of water to it. I'm going to take my stencil and randomly place it on this book and then use that little spatula to spread out the spackling over it. And I'm just going to continue working this stencil all the way around my graphic image, being careful not to get too close to it. Once the spackling has completely dried and hardened, then I'm going to go back over it with some more black chalk paint and just kind of go over the stenciling and get close to that image. I'm basically using the frame around the graphic as a template. At this time, I'm also going to do the book pages side, so I'm just using a little bit of tans and browns and mixing those together to make the book pages look old and worn. Then I used a liner brush with some of that dark brown paint and went down each individual groove so you could tell where the book pages were. Once the clay frame was completely dry, I went in and painted it with 2 coats of the black chalk paint. Then I used a little bit of gel super glue to attach this to the front of the book around that graphic. There was still a little bit of the white and the graphic showing through at the bottom and the top of the frame, so I just added a little more black chalk paint. Then to finish off the front of this book vase, I'm using some European Gold Rub and Buff and a very small paintbrush going over that frame and all of the stenciling that I did. And this is just going to bring out all those raised details. I wanted the spine of the book vase to look like an actual book, so I'm using this little Dollar Tree stencil. It has lines on it and I am just going to be using those. You can draw these lines on yourself, but I wanted to use the Rub and Buff so that it would be the same color as the front. I also used the Rub and Buff and that small paintbrush to do the wording on the spine. I did the title as Eternal Life and then put E Monk at the bottom.